you have this belief in something that I yearn for, which is something transcendent and something that gives some kind of ultimate meaning. Now, I don't share your worldview, but I find it kind of thrilling that there are people who really hold to this. So I'd like to understand where you get that confidence
from. It's fascinating because I get it partly from science. I don't see a war between science and religion as many do. I see a war between two worldviews, theism and atheism. Science sits in the middle, and the real question is, which way does science point?
Hey everyone, thanks for joining us. Today's conversation is going to be about the big ideas: science, religion, God, the universe, meaning, purpose, the whole shebang. And I'm so pleased that I'm in conversation today with John Lennox, who is a mathematician, professor emeritus here at Oxford, well known to the wider public through his many wonderful books, his debates, discussions about science and religion and the big ideas that I just mentioned. So, John, thanks so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure to be with the author of The Elegant Universe that I enjoyed years ago when I bought it.
Well, thank you so much. And so, Mathematician, I guess you have focused in your math work on group theory and things of that sort.
That's right. I have been an Algebraist, and I studied in Cambridge with Philip Hall and Jim Roseblade. And it seems a long time ago now. But all the time I was doing mathematics, I was very interested in the bigger question: where does maths fit in science? Where does science fit in our understanding of the universe? And so on. So that general philosophical philosophy of science kind of question was with me from my teenage, actually.
It's very interesting you say that, because that, I would say, almost the same collection of words as a physicist. I got into thinking about gravity and quantum mechanics and string theory, yes, for the ideas, but also to see what they might tell us about how we fit into a larger picture and what these ideas might tell us about the questions that we as a species have struggled with forever. So, where do we fit in? How does do you view mathematics as, the work of some more powerful intelligence that sets us a puzzle to figure it out? Or do we make up these questions that we artificially think are interesting and pursue them as a kind of mind exploration?
I think yes to both questions. It seems to me that mathematics is both discovered and created. That behind the universe there is a mind, the mind of God. But that taking the cue from the Hebrew book at the beginning of the Tanakh, the Bible, I find it fascinating that according to that narrative, the very first task that God gave the humans was taxonomy, to name the animals. And taxonomy of the whole universe is what science is engaged in. So that it's almost as if God said, I've built this universe, I've made you, but you go and study it. I'm not going to tell you what it's all about. You find out for yourself, which I think is a very deep idea, because it traceably and arguably was the motivation of the early modern science, like Galileo, Kepler, Newton, Clerk Maxwell, and so on. There was a strong connection between the biblical worldview, this is a rationally created universe, and let's study it because it's worth studying.
And so if we encounter alien intelligence at some point, do you think they'll have the same mathematics that we do?
I haven't the slightest idea. I think I'm always interested in alien intelligence. I'm sure you know Paul Davis very well.
Yeah.
And Paul is always, like you, worth reading. And I was at the launch of one of his books in London, and the book was called Are We Alone?
Yes,
you
I know
see.
that book, yeah.
Yes, and Paul was discussing this, and eventually I was asked what I thought. Well, did I believe in alien intelligence? And I rather cheekily but deliberately said, yes, there's at least one big one, and that's God. And the discussion really flowed from there. I think we just don't know. But from the perspective of the biblical worldview, I believe there are other intelligences than ourselves already in, well, you say the universe, and in reality at some level, because I don't think this universe is necessarily all that there is. And you might agree with that, of course, as a
Possibly,
physicist
for sure.
even, yes. So that there are other intelligences. If they develop mathematics, I suspect, and I think this may be using another of your phrases, it's somehow embedded in the fabric of reality, isn't it? I remember meeting Paul Erdős.
Sure.
You know about him,
course,
and
yep.
we all have an Erdős number.
I even have a Bacon Erdős number, which is a variation on the theme where Kevin Bacon and the Paul
really
Erdős
good.
numbers are combined.
Well, my Erdős number is 2. And
I think mine is as well.
yes, well, we
Yeah.
share that. That's good. And Erdős used to come and say to any mathematician he arrived at the doorstep of, my mind is open. And then when he proved something, it's in the book. He had this idea that there was a kind of Platonic book where all the theorems were in, and we discovered them. I am a bit skeptical about that in the sense that to me, one of the key statements in the Hebrew Bible is that we're made in the image of God. So he's a creator. We are made creators. So I do think there is something in mathematics that's genuinely discovered by human minds. And I think you have participated in that process, and I have, a lot less, but just a little bit, in discovering something new.
But given that, and again, I don't mean this in a facetious way, but I mean, does God know the proof of the Riemann hypothesis? I mean...
I suspect so. I suspect so, but again, speculation is very easy, isn't it? And what God knows and what he doesn't know. But
are there things that God doesn't know?
That he chooses not to know. I doubt that. Epistemology, of course, is a very complicated thing, and it interests me greatly because I think there are a couple of things going on. Now, one of the things I remember about that book of yours, The Elegant Universe, was how it ended. Do you remember how it ended?
I believe I do.
It's talking about a ladder.
Yes.
And science today making a rung in the ladder reaching up to the stars.
Right.
So this is scientists probing the universe, using their minds and so on. Now, I think there's another process, and that is God reaching down to us. And I would describe that under the descriptor of revelation, that there are two things happening. There's us probing the universe with the abilities I believe we've been given and discovering things. But then there's a process of revelation, for which, in my book, the biblical worldview is the key thing, both the history of Israel, and in which I am deeply interested and have written about it.
Sure.
And also the revelation through Jesus Christ, that this is God reaching down. So you have two processes going on at once. You have the Brian Greenes of this world building up the rungs, and wonderfully so, and it's a fascinating thing. I believe a God-given endeavour. But you've also the other side, which I think is a more personal dimension. God revealing the answers to the questions that science cannot answer, which brings us, of course, to the inevitable epistemological question: can science tell us everything? Well, depending on how you define science, sure. I don't think it can.
Neither
and
do
I don't think you do either.
I totally agree that it doesn't. it's perhaps worth saying, it's interesting. I sit here across from you, and unlike many in our audience and various audiences who come at things from the more scientific side, I don't recoil at a worldview that has God deeply intertwined with it. In fact, I sit here and I take great comfort, I have to say, sitting across from you, because you have this belief in something that I yearn for.
Really?
Which is something transcendent and something that gives some kind of ultimate meaning and purpose and justification. Now, I don't share your worldview, but I find it kind of thrilling that there are people who really hold to this. So I'd like to understand where you get that confidence.
Well,
from.
it's fascinating because I get it partly from science. You see, I recall something else, which means that your book made an impression, that you said that when you understand the mathematics of some physical process, it makes you feel, quote, nearer to the cosmos, or something like that.
Yes.
Now,
in fact, I actually use the word, I feel a kind of communion
yes,
with the cosmos.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, you see, I just go one step further.
Right.
Because what mathematics does for me is, you know the old paper by Wigner, The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics.
Yeah.
Well, I think it is unreasonably effective if you're an atheist, but not if you're a believer in God. I think it's perfectly reasonably effective for the simple reason that the universe and the scientists who study it both have their ultimate origin in the same divine intelligence. So that seems to me, it's not a surprise that we can understand it. But what it brings me to, Brian, is that this, what you call communion with the cosmos, and certainly I respect that. I don't recoil from that either, at all. I find it fascinating, because for me it is a rung on the ladder that's pointing in the right direction. And I would sum that up in saying that what mathematics reveals to me is that this is a word-based universe. Let me explain what I mean by that.
Like in the beginning was the word? I mean,
Very much like that. I'll come to that in a moment. But the fact that mathematics is a language,
right.
A very sophisticated, it's actually a group of languages, many languages with words special to them, like manifolds and space-time and all of that. But it's word-based in the precision of mathematical equations. And it's word-based, moving to another field, biologically, in the genetic discovery of the longest word. Now, a chemical word, not a mathematical word.
The human genome?
The human genome.
Right.
And this is word-based. Now, if you go back to Genesis, what I find so interesting about it, and it's 100 Hebrew words, Genesis 1, and God said. And God said. Now, that, for most of my life, has resonated very deeply with me, because in the New Testament, there's the famous fourth gospel, where it starts by saying this: in the beginning was the Word, the Logos. And it means already was. The Word never came to be. And then it goes on to say, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things, and the Greek text is very precise, not all things were made by him, but all things came to be through him. This universe came to be. What that is saying, and I believe it's unpacking Genesis in a way, God said, the things came to be through the Word, the divine Word which is God. So that resonates very deeply with me, with the mathematical side of my mind. But it goes beyond the mathematical describability and intelligibility of the universe, because God is not a theory, but a person. It infuses that with transcendent meaning. And that's a very different thing, as you know.
But doesn't that just kick the can further down the road? Take Wigner's question, the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics. I resonate to that question. I thrill to that question. I find it utterly astounding, dare I say, a miracle that mathematics is able to do what it does.
Wigner said that.
That's right.
It's almost a miracle.
That's right. But for me to then look to God as the explanation, to me that's substituting a word, God, for some kind of urge for an answer. And that's what we human beings do, right? We rely on words for explanations. But I would just say the obvious question, like, where does God come from? Where does God gain this intelligibility? Where does God come up with these words that are able to give us a deeper explanation for how it is that our equations work and so forth?
I understand that very well indeed, because it's one of the pushbacks that I've had all along the way for many years. And Dawkins was one of the ones who pushed very hard on this. But you see, talking about where God came from seems to me to be sitting at a point where you're not recognizing that there can be something eternal. In other words, and that's why I was emphasizing John's Gospel is so careful. The universe came to be. God never came to be. He is eternal. But then the huge claim of Christianity is the word that never came to be human. Now, you say it's just a word that's put in there to satisfy. And it's possible that that's part of the reason. But you see, if it's true, then that would be a perfectly sensible starting reason. But you would have to ask, on the basis of your point you've just made, is there any other evidence?
Yeah.
And you see, that's where I come back to the question of revelation and what the Hebrew prophetic tradition has to say, which I take immensely seriously. Abraham, for me, is a key figure in the history of thought. Now, it's a moot point whether he taught mathematics to the Egyptians. I don't know whether you were aware of that.
No.
That is a famous Jewish tradition.
Wow.
I would like
there
to
we go.
think...
I should know this.
Yes. I would like to think that might be true.
Yeah.
But I've written a book on Abraham. And it seems to me this revelation of God in history, not just through philosophy, but through history, through personal relations, through Abraham, through his people, and all of that. That is hugely important to me as evidence that there's something going on here flowing into the New Testament.
But why evidence? That's the key question for me, because I love biblical stories, but I hear them as human stories, as our ancient brethren looking around the world and doing what we humans have done since we gathered around the campfires in hunter-gatherer days, which is tell stories to try to give coherence and meaning to our everyday lives. And so from your perspective, you're infusing these, I mean, the Bible, I trust you view it as a human-written document. It could be the Word of God, but it was human beings who set down the text.
And it's full of wonderful stories. And I'm an Irishman, and I love storytelling.
Perfect.
Like you.
Perfect.
We both love stories.
So we, as a species, have a predilection to story, to look to story, to explanation. Why do you infuse those stories with something beyond human imagination and creativity and see them as speaking to some deeper truth?
Well, of course, that's a question that deserves an answer. Do I infuse them? Take the Standard Model in physics. That's a terrific story, isn't it? It's a wonderful story. But am I right in thinking that you believe that story, at least in part? It changes a bit on times, because it's evidence-based, at least in part. And it's the same, it's not either or. I think the Hebrew stories are brilliant, and one of the best interpreters of them, I wonder if you know him, is Professor Leon Kass in Chicago.
I do know
Who's
the name.
an absolute genius. His book on Genesis is the best by far I've ever read in the beginning of Philosophical Introduction to Genesis. Wonderful storytelling. But I feel I think there's evidence that they have a base in history. And that doesn't take from the story, but I don't think it's infusing them.
But can you go further on that?
Oh, I
on that
can. I
evidence?
can go a
Yeah.
long way further. Because it seems to me that you have to first of all ask of any narrative what it claims for itself. And coming to the New Testament, I quoted the beginning of John's Gospel. He, interestingly enough, towards the end of his book, gives his purpose in writing, for writing. And it's fascinating because it goes like this. Jesus did many other things in the presence of his disciples which are not written in this book. But these are written, that you might believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that believing you might have life in his name. In other words, John understands his writing as evidence based on the acts, the doings, the deeds of Jesus, the miracles, the supernatural dimension, as evidence that points. And I use the word evidence because I'm a mathematician. I don't use the word proof. Because as you know, rigorous proof you only get in pure mathematics.
Sure.
All the rest is pointers. Look at this. Doesn't this indicate that the standard model makes sense, etc., etc.? You have pointers and evidence. Now, my approach to the whole sphere is that both in science and in, if you like, religion or theology, evidence base is at the heart of it. But there's a difference in the sense that when you're dealing with science, you generally are speaking of how and the why of function. Why is this bit here, not there? Sure. You are not speaking about the teleological why of purpose, but that doesn't mean it isn't real. Peace be to Dawkins and one or two others who didn't regard it as real. And it seems to me, therefore, that evidence-based belief is what science is all about. Why do you believe the standard model? Why do you have faith in it? Because there's evidence for it. Absolutely, I'm with that. And it's exactly the same between me and my wife, as I put to Dawkins. My faith in her, been married to her 58 years this year, is based on evidence. It's not crazy. So it's evidence-based faith in a person. And my faith in God, as I understand it, is evidence-based faith in a person. Now, part of the evidence is the whole Jewish tradition, first of all, then the New Testament. But it's also my own experience and my observation of the experience of others. So there's a psychological dimension to it, there's a cultural dimension to it. But when it all is adding together, I go for the explanation that makes the best sense. Now, I seem to recall that in your book, that it's one of the interests of yours, what is the nature of explanation?
Yeah.
I am very interested in that as well. And it seems to me there are explanations at different levels.
I think that's exactly right. And so let me just
Yeah.
go to the standard model, just
yes,
raise
please.
it as an interesting case. So I wouldn't use the word belief. I'm not trying to nitpick. I would say have confidence in the standard model.
Yeah, well, that's fine. Well, you trust it. You
trust
believe in it. That's where fides,
right.
The word for faith, comes from the Latin for trust.
Good.
I'll go with that.
Now, all the same, there are experiments that if they turned out differently from what the standard model predicts, I would drop the standard model in a heartbeat and look for a distinct explanation. So it's deeply falsifiable.
Yes, exactly.
So are there things that you could imagine would cause you to drop your trust in a God because it deviated from your expectation or your prediction, if I use the scientific term, and therefore it is as falsifiable?
Oh, sure. And I think that's an excellent question. And I get that from science. But people used to ask me, look, you're crazy. You believe this Christianity stuff. It's not testable. You see, it's not falsifiable in any sense. But that isn't true. The central Christian claim is that God raised Jesus from the dead as a historical fact. Now, that kind of claim is falsifiable. Maybe difficult to falsify, but in theory, it was very clearly falsifiable at the beginning. The whole of Christianity would have been stopped dead if the body had been produced. It wasn't produced, etc., etc. But you see, there's another level at which you can test things.
But can I just push on that a little bit?
Yes, you can.
So that's based on a handful of human beings giving eyewitness testimony
yes,
2,000 years ago.
Yes.
What gives you confidence in having your world view based on a handful of humans from thousands of years ago? That wouldn't form a sufficient bedrock for me.
Well, I think if you put it that way, it sounds weak. But you know, if you talk to a classicist or ancient historian who talks to you about Caesar's writings and tells you they're authentic and authoritative, and you ask, what's the manuscript evidence? You find it is very, very little compared with the vast bit of evidence for the authenticity and the accuracy of the biblical documents. And you know the way the rabbis treated the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, the accuracy and the concern of getting everything right. I think the fact that it's 2,000 years ago is almost irrelevant, because the people who were writing were significant in the sense that some of them were very bright people, like the Apostle Paul, and they were writing right close up to the events. And I could describe events 50 years ago pretty accurately. I don't think that's a big problem, because there are two approaches to this. There's the approach through ancient history. And I used to get a bit impatient listening to people, even Dawkins, until he began to realize he was talking nonsense, doubting the existence of Jesus and all this kind of thing. He's given up that kind of talk quite wisely, because ancient historians are amazingly agreed. And I'm talking about atheist ancient historians, not just Christian. As a human being, yeah. Exactly. But you see, there's another level to it, if I may, and that is this. It's the existential level. You see, Christ made certain claims. One, that he would rise from the dead, and so the logical consequence of that is he's still alive, and that individual human beings throughout history could have a relationship with God through him that would transform them. And you mentioned earlier a longing for transcendence. I think that's in every human heart. And where I found satisfaction of that is, I learned early on, because I grew up in a Christian family, but they allowed me to think. That was very unusual in Northern Ireland in those days, as you can guess. They let me think. They introduced me to other worldviews, which is even more unusual. My father presented me with the Communist Manifesto when I was about 14. Oh. And I said, Dad, have you read it? And he said, no. I said, well, why should I read it? Never forget his answer. You need to know what other people think. And that's the way I was brought up, to consider other worldviews. Well, to come back to the point, Jesus claimed, and the apostles preached, that if we, and I'll just lay it out, it may mean very little, but you need to hear what is said before you can understand what it means, that if we do what the Jewish prophets called Israel to do again and again, which was repent, turn away from their evil ways and turn back to God. If we do that and trust Christ, there's something he did by dying and rising that will bring us, one, peace with God, freedom from guilt, a satisfaction of knowing God, and a power to live. Now, I have seen that in my own life, the life of my family, and the life of countless others throughout my life. And to my mind, it's testable. Let me tell you a little story about Harvard. You probably know, one of the great universities, where John Harvard went to my college at Cambridge before he founded it. I was giving a lecture in Harvard, and I finished the lecture, and a young Chinese student stood up on the balcony. The place was absolutely packed, a couple of thousand probably, and he shouted, "Look at me." You see, of course we all looked, and he was looking at me, and I was at the front. And I called back, I said, "Why should we look at you?" He was beaming with a smile. He said, "Listen," he said, "a few months ago I came to Penn State and you were lecturing there. And I heard something that night that sparked in my mind a search. And I got a Bible and I started to talk to people. And eventually I decided this was true. And I became a Christian." And he said, "I was at my wit's end when I heard you. Contemplating suicide," I think he said. He was in a total mess. And he was beaming. He said, "Look at what's happened to me." And it was one of the best sermons I've ever seen. Right. Because here's somebody testifying to transformation. Now, of course, you can psychologize all that out of existence.
Which is what I was about to just do.
Of course you were. It's easy to do that, but when you see it again and again and again, it's like a medical treatment in a way. The first time it works, that's coincidence. The second, but when it keeps working and becomes an established bit, you begin to think, well, there's something in this.
But doesn't that perhaps speak to a ubiquitous, ancient, species-wide existential anxiety?
It could do.
We all fear death. We all long for something that will infuse us with something that makes the trials and tribulations of everyday life seem like they're part of a plan and there's a reason for what we're doing. And so if we all have that urge, and then some very creative, smart people, well-meaning people come along and say, if you believe this, that, and the other, all of those urges and desires will be satisfied. You don't die. You're not done when you die. Your physical body may be done, but you continue onward. And there's justification and justice at the end of this long trial that you've been on that is so seductive to a human being who's a little morsel scrambling around an indescript planet in this galaxy that's one of hundreds. I mean, there seems to be an interesting story to tell there, which is really much more psychological and anthropological. Why wouldn't that story be enough? Why does it need, in your mind, to go one step further and actually be objectively true? Why is that important?
Well, because it makes such a difference. I'm not convinced, by the way, that your seductive explanation of that power of that story is right. Otherwise, I think a lot more people would believe it. But I take the point where you're coming from. All of that could be right, but it could still be true.
Yes, I totally agree.
It's not an anti-truth argument.
Yeah.
And that is very important. And you see, coming on to the flip side, if it is true, you would expect it to work. And that's the side on which I am. I mean, I've spent my life, to be very open with you, being brought up in a strong Christian culture, but allowed to think. I've spent my life talking to people like you.
Yes.
Because I want to know what's true. I don't want to be fooled. And so that's why I'm so happy when I get invited to talk about these things, because they give me the opportunity to do what Richard Feynman taught me. Be critical of yourself, because he said, you are the most easy person that you can deceive. Well, and I think he's dead right.
Yeah, but given that, I'll give you a little story of my own.
Yes, please.
Years ago, I was invited to a gathering of scientists and I guess philosophers who are going to come together and speak about religious themes and ideas. I thought that would be interesting. I went, but I also thought that everybody there was going to share my perspective. When I got there, I realized I was the only one who wasn't really a believer, and I don't think I'm breaking any confidence. Bill Phillips, Nobel
Oh,
laureate.
I know Bill.
Yeah, he was one of the physicists there,
Yes,
so
I
I
know
had
Bill.
a direct knowledge and connection to him. And after the event, I said to him, "So Bill, like when you look at someone like me, do you look at like a lost sheep that somehow has, And he put his arm around me and said, you're on the trajectory. It felt like, So my question to you is, someone like me, who is deeply open to everything that you're describing, but has yet to be convinced even one iota of the actual truth of these ideas. Yet I'm so open to them. I don't know. Richard and I have discussed this to some extent. I think I'm nearly infinitely more open than he is to these ideas. Why haven't I been convinced?
Oh gosh, how would I know that? But that's very interesting, Bill Phillips' response. You see, I'm sitting here, and part of my honor, I would say, in chatting to you, is that it's your own Hebrew tradition that plays for me a huge part in my faith in God. You may not believe this, but before I came in here today, what was I studying? The Hebrew language. Because at this age, crazy, I should have done it long ago, it was fascinating. But I've spent time in Bar Ilan, and I expect you know where Bar Ilan is. I was a visiting professor there, and the discussion there, they tried to keep me for a year, and I'd love to have stayed and learned the language. But anyway, that's all under the road. I think that tradition and my studies, and I've written a book on Abraham, I've written a book on Daniel, I've written a book on Joseph, 3 major figures in Jewish history. And all of that has confirmed my faith in Jesus as the Messiah. And
it's not confirmation bias that you go in.
Oh, no, not at all. I was taught by a very bright classicist who was a biblical scholar, and he taught me to be very critical in the Feynman sense. Of course, I'm biased. We're all biased, but one hopes one biases are at least quasi-intelligent. And I have no idea when you say, why haven't I? You see, what comes into my head immediately is another American professor who's not a professor of physics, but a professor of chemistry, and a professor of nanotechnology, and a professor of computer science simultaneously. The only man I know who has 3 chairs. I wonder, do you know him?
I'm not sure who you're referring
James Tour of Rice University.
I don't think I do, yeah.
Now, James is a fascinating character because, like yourself, he's Jewish. But he is what one calls a Messianic Jew. And he has the most remarkable challenge. And Alex O'Connor, whom you know,
sure,
and you've interviewed him, he's interviewed you, and he's interviewed me. The last time he interviewed me, I mentioned James Tour to him. And I said, James Tour is one of the most prolific scientists I know. And Rice University, I think 50% of its spin-off companies are his patents. I mean, he really is incredible as a chemist. But he has got this resurrection challenge that he puts out in the line. And if anybody wants to know, he will never push anybody. But his challenge is, if you want to know why I believe that Jesus physically rose from the dead, which is the basis of his Christian faith, he will meet them on the internet and talk to them about it. Now, I know of no other university professor, including me, who'll do that. You should Google him because he's just fascinating. And his testimony of how he made the step from his Judaism to Christianity is told on a website, very unusual website. You may know it, 14israel.com.
No, I don't know.
In words. Well, it's worth watching because there's a scientist and he lectures all over the place. If you Google him, James Tour, I would be most interested, actually,
I mean, is it personal revelation?
It's personal, but it's also his science. I mean, he is absolutely fascinating character.
I mean, have you had personal moments where you say, this for me is firsthand evidence?
Oh, I have, yes.
Are you willing to share any? Or?
Oh, absolutely. I've just published my autobiography, My Story, and I didn't like the word auto, talking about yourself. And so I decided to pitch it a bit differently. This is what I believe happened to me. Judge it for yourself and see what you think. So in the Amazon list, it came up as number 1 in atheism and agnosticism. So something has succeeded. There have been several things, not all the time, but shall I give you one example, which got me going to Russia? I was at a conference, Mathematical Cryptography in Belgium, and mathematical cryptography, information theory is utterly fascinating, zero knowledge protocols and all this kind of thing. And at the end of the conference, the bus driver took us to the station, and he had a friend on the bus, and he dropped him off on the wrong side of the railway line, and we all missed the train. So 50 weary mathematicians got into this train going from Belgium to Cologne in Germany, and it was the evening, and I was a bit nervous, Cologne station in the middle of the night kind of thing. And I got into a compartment and discovered that there were 4 of us, I think. There was me, there was a Belgian student, a Belgian woman, a German student, a Belgian woman, and 2 Russians. And because I speak Russian to a certain extent, I started talking to the Russian man who was beside me. And he said he came from Baikal, deepest freshwater lake in the world, and all the rest. And he was an ecologist. Now, this is 89, and I said, an ecologist? Are you allowed to do ecology out there? And he said, we are. And suddenly, it just came from left field. I said, are there other things that you can talk about, which you couldn't talk about before? He said, like what? And I just said, kakbog, like God. And suddenly, he said yes to that, but suddenly I was seized with a desire to give the man a Bible. Now, you're speeding in a train through Belgium. He's Russian. I'm English. Where do you get a Bible in a train, a Russian Bible? Because he spoke no English. And I sat there and I couldn't get this out of my head. I kept talking to him a little bit, and you must give him a Bible. And then eventually I remembered that several weeks before, I'd been in a home in Germany with a publisher, and on his desk there was a lovely Russian Bible, and I picked it up. He said, do you want it? I can't read it. Oh, I says, beautiful print, I love it. And I put it in my suitcase. And I recalled this, and I thought, did I take it out when I was at home? Surely I left it at home. So I stand up, put my hand inside the suitcase. It was still there.
It's a beautiful story.
I'm not finished it.
Okay, yeah.
I'm not finished it. I handed it to him, and he went white with shock. I said, that's for you. Then he said, how did you know? I said, what? How did I know what? He said, how did you know that the only Bible we've ever seen or possessed was stolen from us 8 weeks ago in Siberia, and we'd never any hope of getting another one? And I looked at him and I said, do you believe this book? He said, I don't know, but she does. His wife was in the opposite seat, and I can see her now. She took it, she kissed it, the tears were streaming down her face, and they were gone in the night. Next station. And the German student looked at me and she said, does that often happen to you? I said, no, not every Thursday, it doesn't. But she said, that's incredible. I said, no, it isn't. These people have been denied for the past 70 years access to the scriptures. I was just being a postman tonight. Oh, she said, if that's the case, I'd better start reading it for myself. And she did, but that's another story.
Right.
Now, when I got home, this is the key point, not that story, but what happened. I was standing at the door of my home, and as I was moving, putting down my suitcase, I told my wife about this. And I hadn't even sat down. She said, "You'd better cancel your diary for the next while." I said, "Why?" Now, she's never done this before or since. She said, "Because you are going to Russia." And I said, "What? How would you go to Russia?" Well, I said, "Look, let me sit down and get my clothes off. How would you go to Russia?" I said, "Well, there's an agreement between the Royal Society and the Academy of Sciences. Ring them up." I said, "Now, just wait a minute. It's a very lengthy process. Ring them up." She's never done anything like this before. So, in order to get into the house and sit down, I rang them up. And there followed the most remarkable conversation, because the chap said, "We're desperate to get mathematicians out of Russia. Are you prepared to go?" And she was listening, she could hear. Because our problem is, it's 1 week for 1 week, and the Russians are very strong in this. We need someone to go for longer. She said, "Give them 2 months." What? So I said, "How would it be if I went for 2 months?" He said, "You can go tomorrow if you like." No forms, nothing. We're desperate for people to go. And that is what precipitated one of the biggest adventures in my life. I think it was a God moment.
So it's, again, as I was saying, even midway through, it is a beautiful story, only more so when I heard the rest of it.
Yes.
But nevertheless, as I hear that story, it makes sense to me without invoking anything divine. And so that's sort of what I meant by...
Tell me what sense it makes.
Well, I feel like I can explain each step of the story using completely physicalist, naturalistic,
You
materialist...
feel that you can explain.
Yes. For instance, had you not had the Bible in your luggage, I suspect you wouldn't have viewed that as a mark against the divine power. There are certain things that we call coincidences that on occasion are gonna happen, and this was a wonderful example of that. And so that's where my mind goes.
Yes.
Whereas your mind goes to a divine explanation, which makes sense.
No,
because
it doesn't. It goes to both explanations. And I choose the divine explanation because it makes much more sense of everything that happened afterwards. It's a question of being a cumulative thing.
Sure.
I mean, I've heard those kind of arguments.
Of course.
And when you're not in the situation, you can multiply hypotheses endlessly and coincidence, whatever that means. But there comes a point where I think the argument from coincidences wears very thin. You see, I believe it was a God moment, but I'm not going to stake my life completely on that. I want something bigger than that, which is, I look at life from two sides, and they overlap a bit. Roughly speaking, the subjective and the objective. And I get what I would call objective evidence of a mind behind the universe from science, as I explained earlier. But then the subjective relationship part, in my response to God and Christ, that builds up a whole level of confidence, just in a way, but going far beyond your kind of confidence in the standard model. So I'm confident in putting it out there. And as I said, the way I've written my autobiography, here's what's happened to me, you judge it.
Right.
And if you're happy with your explanation, there's nothing that I can do or would want to do in that sense. I set it out there, and having experienced scientific browbeating in my life of the worst kind, a Nobel Prize winner telling me directly that I'd never make it in mathematics if I held on to my naive faith in God. That's in my autobiography as well. That's the unacceptable face of it. And I resolved then, let's put it out there. Let's have good discussions between friendly people of different worldviews and let the people judge.
Which I think is a healthy and
well, of course, it's your
way of doing
attitude.
it.
Yes, wonderful.
You made reference to the resurrection
I
as
did.
one piece of historical evidence. Now, of course, obviously, science as we know it is incompatible with that happening. So you must.
I don't think it is at all.
Well, the Standard Model, for instance, applied to the particles of Jesus, and it would not have those particles coalesce in a way that would reanimate and so forth. But presumably, and do tell me if I'm wrong, you imagine that God does intercede and can go beyond.
Intervene, sure.
Right.
Because it comes back, and this would also be a very interesting discussion, the nature of the laws of nature.
Yes.
And I think Wittgenstein was right on this when he pointed out they're not causes. And of course, there's the big question of where they come from anyway.
Big question.
But Newton's laws never caused a rocket to move its motors and things. They're descriptive.
I agree.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And what do they describe? What normally happens? Gravity will describe that if I drop this glass, it'll fall towards the center of the earth. It doesn't stop you catching it. Now, that's a very crude example.
Of course.
But it seems to me that the whole question of the supernatural, miracle is not a good word because it simply means something that's wondered at. It's a miracle that John passed his exam, that kind of stuff.
Sure.
But the supernatural dimension, it seems to me the interesting thing is that recognizing it depends on a prior knowledge of what normally happens.
Yes.
So you need to know the laws of nature.
So that it can stand out.
Yeah,
relative to that.
exactly.
Yes.
And science, which is natural science, we need to be careful here because the continental meaning of science tends to be much wider. But if you think of science in terms of physical naturalistic explanations, of course can't deal with these things. And it was the famous geologist, what was his name, wonderful writer, who pointed out that half of his friends were believers and half weren't, and that science cannot adjudicate the matter of God. And I think that's to a certain extent true, but we can deduce certain things from science that point in the direction of God. It's not neutral, in my view.
But this is not a deistic stance.
Oh, no.
Because that, of course, is a stance that I can nod my head vigorously.
Yes, I know.
You know,
I can understand that. Yes.
God sets it up and it runs and doesn't intercede.
It's yes.
So my question to you,
God
though, is...
does intervene, I believe, historically.
So if there are anomalies that, say, we encounter, and that, for instance, an anomaly in black body radiation led to quantum mechanics.
Yes.
An anomaly in the motion of the planet Mercury helped Einstein figure out general relativity and so forth. When is an anomaly something that is pointing scientists in the direction of make your science better versus an anomaly that's suggesting, hey, you need to step outside the normative in order to explain this? How would you suggest adjudicating that?
I think that is entirely up to maturity of experience and knowledge of both fields. And I think we have to be careful there because you made the point earlier on using God just to fill in. I'm very allergic to that. What I mean by that is the so-called God of the gaps. You can't explain it, therefore God did it. So you can't understand thunder, so you postulate a God of thunder. Then you have a lecture on atmospheric physics and that God disappears.
Right.
And I think that is where Genesis helps us, and it's very innocent but brilliant opening sentence. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It doesn't start by saying, in the beginning, God created the bits of the universe you don't yet understand, which would be absurd. He created everything, heavens and earth. It's a merism in grammar. Everything, the bits you do understand and the bits you don't. And it seems to me, therefore, important to realize that many of the scientists who used their science as part of their trajectory before God were very careful to indicate that it was the stuff they did understand that points towards God. And I would take my place there. It's the fact that the universe is, at least in part, mathematically intelligible that points in that direction. When Newton discovered his law of gravitation, was it the first or the third, I'm not sure, edition of his book Principia, had in the foreword, I hope that this will persuade the thinking person to believe in a deity.
Right.
It was the bits he did understand.
Sure. Now, that's an interesting historical fact that many of the great scientists of the earlier era were seeing science as a proof of their theological
An
perspective,
evidence, yes.
as opposed to
Yes,
something in tension
that's absolutely right.
with it. But do you not see that as understandable historically, that we came out of a tradition where we didn't understand much about the external world? We posited a God in order to at least have some coherent explanation. And it took a while as we began to develop our science to begin to shed the theological view. And Newton was a transition figure, and Galileo was a transition figure. That doesn't hold any historical or...
Well, not really much power, because, you see, it's cumulative for me. There's all the other stuff going on. Revelation in the Hebrew prophets and all the rest of it, and in the history of Christianity and all of that. It seems to me it's much more sophisticated than that. And very careful scholars, and I know some because I've written on this stuff, say that there is this intimate connection between the rise of modern science and the biblical worldview, which is one of the reasons why science, as distinct from technology, did not arise in China in the same way as it did in the West. And one of the experts on it...
You mean because of their theological views?
That's exactly the view of the expert on it, whose name I've just dropped for the moment. He was in Cambridge. And he spoke Chinese and helped their education system. And he was a neo-Marxist. And he tried to explain the lack of rise of science as we understand it in terms of Marxism, and he ended up failing to do so. And he said the honest conclusion he came to was the Chinese lacked the notion of a creator. And that's very interesting.
I'm sure you can make a case.
Yes, you can make a case, which is a straw in the wind, but I think it's pointing in a good direction.
Yeah, right. No, it's an interesting point for sure. But I am interested in
I think it was Needham. Joseph Needham.
I'm not familiar, but it's an interesting way of describing the developments. But my question to you is, you mentioned God of the gaps is a potential pitfall. You know, thunder.
It is.
Yeah.
It is very risky. And there are sadly people that do take that view. But you see, I think it's worth going, and this is Polkinghorne, interestingly enough. There seem to be good gaps and bad gaps. There's the gaps that science closes.
Yes.
But there's the gaps that science opens.
Sure.
And those are the ones. And Polkinghorne has a phrase in one of his very interesting books where he says, we are unashamedly people of the gaps. Now, Polkinghorne was a Christian, you know. And it's those kind of gaps where science points beyond itself, and the mathematical describability of the universe is one of those things. And Einstein noticed.
Well, let me just give you a hypothetical then, which are always dangerous because hypotheticals have assumptions and you can always challenge them. But what if the gaps that seem to be of a different character than, say, thunder or the electron-magnetic moment, what if those gaps are closed? For instance, what if we really do come up with an airtight mathematical explanation, not of the development of the universe from early times, the Big Bang Theory or inflationary cosmology? What if we really had a tight mathematical, testable description of creation? Or what if we really had a tight, testable mathematical description of the origin of life, not just the workings of life, but the true origin? If we were to close those gaps, would that have any impact on your thinking? Well, it
depends on what the presuppositions were. You're saying a tight mathematical description of the origin of life. But what do you mean by a mathematical description? Because it always raises the question of the existence of the stuff itself. Where does that come from? and the describability in terms of mathematics, where does that come from? Tight mathematical descriptions, it seems to me, are an argument more for God than against him.
So let's take it one step further. And of course, here you no doubt will have a retort, where does logic come from? But I'm now guessing your response. Imagine that...
I will.
Well, imagine we had an argument that logical consistency alone required our universe with all of the features that we have. It had to be created, had to have living systems on one planet, and so forth. I mean, this is the kind of issue that Einstein himself tussled with, whether the universe could logically be different from the one that we are familiar with. If we were to find an argument from logic that said, you can't not have a universe because that would logically be inconsistent. Logic itself demands a universe. Logic itself demands that on this rocky planet, number 3 from our sun, there be living systems. Would closing the gaps in that way have any impact on your thinking?
Well, I would just simply go on to say, what if logic demanded God, as Kurt Gödel actually argued?
Yeah.
He felt, you probably know.
I'm familiar with it. Yeah.
Exactly. So it seems to me that you're right. You want to say, where does logic come from? Logical argument. It's the whole fundamentals. And this is why I see scientists. I love Einstein's statement. I've been very interested in trying to get inside his mind in a limited way. Of course, I can't. But when he wrote that he couldn't imagine a genuine scientist without that faith, he put his finger on something very important. He wasn't talking about God. He was talking about faith in the mathematical intelligibility of the universe.
Right.
You and I are men of faith.
I agree with you.
I'm delighted to hear it, because so many people, even in this city, think that faith is a religious word and it means believing where there's no evidence.
Right.
Faith is an ordinary word. It means believing, trust, and confidence, and it's worthless if there's no evidence to back it up.
Right.
So that, in one sense, we sit very close.
100%.
You see. And therefore, science sits in the middle. I don't see a war between science and religion, as many do. I see a war between two worldviews, theism and atheism. Science sits in the middle. And the real question is, which way does science point? My conclusion is that science points towards God. And your conclusion is?
That science points toward a physicalist explanation of all that we see, with no need to invoke a God.
Well, where do you get meaning from if physicalism is true and,
it's a great
reductionism?
Question. So I've struggled with that, and I think that helps understand my initial revelation to you that I yearn for the very things that you describe. So how do I find meaning in a fundamentally meaningless universe that has no God behind it? And here's where I've come down. After, 40 years, I was mentioning, I went to Oxford 42 years ago. I've been thinking about it then and ever since. I find it utterly astounding that we, collections of particles, that I believe are fully guided by the laws of quantum physics and relativity, can think about the things that we're talking about, explain at the level of the Standard Model and general relativity the existence of stars and black holes, the collections of molecules and atoms that are responsible for all that's around us. And I just stand in wonder at the fact that we're able to do that. And I have a deep sense of gratitude that we have risen to a point where we, collections of particles, can look back and allow the universe in some sense to observe itself. And that, to me, gives me a sense of meaning and purpose, wonder, and dare I say awe at the existence of this wondrous creation. But it doesn't take me to the next step where it takes you to imagine that there's something behind it, an intelligence. And I would even say, to me, I feel like my wonder is more organic, because I'm not looking to something else or somebody else, some other intelligence, to provide me meaning. I am accepting that I'm alone in this universe, and yet finding comfort and an ability to accept and be thrilled at the opportunity that I've been given for a brief speck of time.
Well, that tells me that you're at least on the second rung towards God, because I share this wonder and awe, but it just strikes me as impossible to derive any satisfactory meaning, which is possibly why you're saying you're yearning for this, from that reductionist explanation. The more I see of the universe, and I love watching David Attenborough or anybody who's showing us the Carl Sagan and all that kind of stuff. I just love that. What that does for me, and in fact, I'm doing a radio broadcast nationwide on Sunday morning coming on this, Science and Gone, is to almost make me sing one of the Hebrew Psalms: the heavens declare the glory of God, and the earth shows his handiwork. Now, I think that is a very organic response, that instead of just having the thing in itself and you wonder at it, it's like a painting. You wonder at it and the genius of the person that produced it. That's not diminishing creation in the slightest bit.
Right. Do you mind fielding a few other counterfactuals just so I can understand?
I'm finding this absolutely fascinating.
So, imagine that we're the only life form in the universe. That's possible, right?
What do you mean, you and I are Homo sapiens?
No, I mean life on planet Earth.
Okay,
Earth
yes.
is the only planet harboring life. Would that raise a question for you as to why this divine presence only created one life-full planet? Would that raise an issue?
Not a question I think about a great deal, because we're not told just how much God has done, but the hint is that we're not the only life forms. Not if you believe in angels, spirit beings. It seems to me that, again, there are hints, but no real details of the other world in that sense. C.S. Lewis has helped me a lot in thinking about that, so that my conclusion is that God may have done all sorts of other things that he hasn't told us about.
Right.
And the excitement will be, because I believe in the world to come, that we'll be told lots of these things in days to come. It wouldn't particularly bother me, because there's a common habit of looking at, I think you mentioned it earlier, here we are in a tiny spinning blue planet going around the sun in one of the regions of a galaxy, which is one of billions of galaxies and so on. But size is not necessarily a measure of importance.
Sure.
And that psalm that I quoted, 8, the heavens declare the glory of God, says, what is man that you are mindful of him? You have made him a little lower than the angels. So there's another life form for you to think about. But what you've done is made man, I'm now paraphrasing, a steward of the creation. Now that, to my mind, is a very powerful motivation, not only for doing science, but for stewarding the creation for the benefit of humankind. Those are very powerful ideas.
And do you have a feel for why, even on this little planet of ours, there are so many different religious traditions, of which the one that you focus upon, is historically an important one in the West, and there are many adherents. Why are there so many other religious traditions that I presume you think are not as true?
We're getting into another fascinating and big question. How can I respond to that briefly? I think we'd first have to ask, what a religion is. And the popular view is a religion is a way of life that is thought up by human beings, and generally speaking, it consists of a gate or maybe two gates and a path between them. Some sort of initiation, and then let me draw a wavy line in the air, and then a gate at the end which represents a judgment, an assessment. And a bit like a university course. You get into the university and then you've got delightful professors to teach you and all the rest of it and the rules and regulations. And then you have an assessment at the end. And that assessment at the end depends on how well you've kept the rules and regulations. Now that's most people's impression of a religion. And many of the world's religions, and I've interacted with quite a few of them because I'm interested in why people think and what they think. That's a very common view. It's even a common view of what Christianity is. But actually it's entirely wrong in the case of Christianity as we find it, and indeed what was revealed to Abraham. And this is where I want to make a caveat, because the moment you start to talk about the differences between religion, the danger is you come across as patronizing and you think that you're better than the other people. Now I want to scotch that immediately. I can be put to shame morally by somebody in a non-Christian religion. And the Bible admits that. Dear old Abraham was a wonderful man, but pagan Pharaoh put him to shame because of his attitude towards his wife and so on. So the important thing is when you raise that question, it's sensitive because people understandably feel committed to the tradition they're in. And if they sense that you're saying, my religion is better than yours, I'm better than you, that actually pushes people apart.
Sure.
Which is why the question is slightly dangerous. But I'm going to say something about it. Because it seems to me that the mistake that's made is the notion of a path coming to an assessment and then you get in at the end if you have the grades. That's university. In Christianity, many religions are like that, and their adherents will tell you that it's like that. I mean, I'm not speaking just my own idea, it's what I'm told. People think Christianity is like that. But you see, it's not like that. It is radically different. Because the Christian message is you won't get through the assessment. You can't do it. You haven't got the strength because you have failed even your own standards, let alone God's standards. The 10 Commandments, try and live with them for a week. It's pretty difficult. So, salvation in most religions is our attempt to keep the rules and satisfy whoever the judge is at the end. In Christianity, it is not. It is not of merit at all. And that's the radical difference. Because as far as Christianity goes, salvation is a gift that God gives to people who trust Christ because they can't make the grade themselves. And what it says is, whatever you make of it, it's another matter, but what it says is that God became human and Christ died as Yeshua, the Savior, and rose again to prove that God had accepted him. So I know that God has accepted me, not because of my merit, but because of what Christ has done. Now that's a radically different idea. And you see, here's the thing. I sometimes tell a little story. Forgive a very simple story. But when I arrived at Cambridge on day 2, I saw a beautiful girl. And I later married her, you see. And I say to people with a straight face, I say, I brought a book, a cookbook, and gave it to her and said, look, I'd like to marry you. Now, let's look at page 146. There's a recipe for apple cake. I love apple cake. Now, here's how it's going to be. It's a tradition in our family, you see. It's a very strange family. But a wife must promise to keep all the rules that make a proper apple cake. And so here's how it's going to be. If you keep these rules for the next 40 years, I will accept you. Otherwise, you can go back to your mother. Now, of course, when I tell that to an audience, everybody laughs hilariously. And I say, you would never insult another human being by telling them that your acceptance of them depended on their merit. You'd never do it. And yet millions of people think of God like that. I'll try and keep the rules all my life in hope that you'll accept me. That is an absolute slavery, which is why in many religions people end up just absolutely... The glorious, and I use that word advisedly, thing about Christianity is, and I'll say this very carefully, Jesus Christ competes with no one because he offers me something that no one else does. And that is peace with God, freedom to live, and if you like, to learn to cook, not because my acceptance depends on it, but because my acceptance is already given. And my wife's a great cook, but what sets her free to do it is my acceptance of her doesn't depend on her performance. So that's the difference, and that's how I would begin to describe what's going on here. But there's a lot more to it than that.
No, and that's actually very helpful for me to understand what it is about Christianity.
Yeah, well, that's great.
That
yes, I
there.
find it a simple but a very helpful explanation. It's not due to me. I got it from someone else and I've modified it slightly. But it is helpful. And relationships, if they're deep, are based on mutual acceptance and trust. And that's the way it is with God. And unfortunately, religion, even so-called Christian religion, which is why I rarely use the word religion, Brian. I don't regard myself as particularly religious. I regard myself as a follower of Jesus who has accepted me and given me new life. So I live for him, not in order to gain acceptance, but because I've got it.
But do you find that, do you think your human relationships would be different if you didn't hold this relationship to, say, Jesus?
Oh, yes. Well,
like, for instance, I know you gave the anecdote with your wife just as a parallel story.
Yes,
to think about one's relationship to God.
It has affected my relationship with her.
But I feel like I have that same relationship with my wife.
Of course you do.
And yet I don't base it on a further relationship with something.
I understand that, and that's perfectly right, because you and she are made in the image of God for relationship. That's absolutely right. But I think it adds another dimension, and it has meant a lot to us in our married life, in our family life, and with other people. On a very simple level, when I meet another person, even if they're very hostile to me, and I've met some of those, I see a person and I reflect, look, this is someone made in the image of God and therefore of infinite value, which is why I do a lot of trying to persuade my Christian friends to take the Hebrew scriptures seriously, because I think there in Genesis, those statements about value made in the image of God are absolutely vitally important for the contemporary world. So of course we can enjoy these good things. And I'm sure you're right about your wife, as I am about my wife. But that idea, you know, I've married very few people in my life in the official sense, but I've done so. And when I do that, I give them a triangle, which is the simplest musical instrument, you see. And I said, you go and hang that up in your house. And remember this, it's you, your wife, and Christ, if they're Christians. And if you sense a bit of trouble, just pick up the little rod and go and ding. And there are a few people around the world. One of them is a famous musician who's got that.
I'm going to buy myself a triangle after this interview.
Yes, yes.
Two other quick things before we're done. So you made reference to the statement that I and many others have made about how we're one little planet in this vast universe. And I can't help but see us within that expanse, and I agree with you, size is not necessarily a measure of importance, but nevertheless, I can't help but think cosmologically about sort of how we fit into a large picture. So it does make me wonder the kinds of questions I've asked, but just another of that ilk. If we were to find that the universe is chock full of life, all over the place,
As something.
and we begin to have conversations with these civilizations on these other planets, if we found that absolutely none of them had any belief along the lines of what we've been discussing here, would that raise a question?
Of course
for
it
you?
would, but we're not there yet.
Good. And what if, just to carry on that theme, they all did have a theological perspective, and they all agreed, 1 trillion other civilizations, but it's different from the one that we're talking about here. Would that also raise...
Of course it would raise a
Yes.
question. But as I say, hypotheticals are easy to raise.
Right, exactly, right. And so looking forward from here, I mean, we're all mortal. I think we are the only species on the planet that's aware of our
Yes.
mortality. How do you approach your own mortal nature?
With great excitement, actually. At one level, I would distinguish two things, death and dying. The process of dying can be sadly horrible. But death, in the ultimate biblical sense of separation from God, I don't fear that. Because what I'm looking forward to is, and here is where my AI hat comes on, because I'm fascinated by the transhumanists and their idea of building superintelligences and all this kind of stuff that you will know about, and merging human beings possibly with machines, or having a silicon base and uploading our brains and all the rest of it. This is humans striving to be God. It's another way of going up the ladder that is at the end of your book, which is such a lovely metaphor. I love it. You see the irony of that. When transhumanists come to me, as they have done from time to time, because I speak in these things, and they tell me about this great program for humanity, I say, you're too late. They say, what? We haven't got there yet. Well, I said, your big agenda, Harari, I'm quoting now, is you're going to bioengineer and increase human happiness, and then you're going to solve the problem of physical death. Those two are his agenda items, Homo Deus, in his book. I say you're too late. Firstly, the problem of physical death was solved 20 centuries ago when God raised Jesus from the dead. And as for uploading your brains, I said I'm looking forward to the biggest uploading in history. And it's that Christ will one day raise me from the dead. I'm mortal. I'm liable to death. I'll die physically. But that's not the end for me, because it wasn't for him. And he will raise me from the dead. And there will be uploading into another world. In fact, physics and chemistry aren't going to end, because it's new heavens and a new earth. That ought to give someone like you a lot of hope. There's a physical
a lot of
dimension.
opportunity to understand.
Yes, there's a physical dimension in the world to come. I do believe in resurrection. Anastasis, the Greek word means standing up again. A physical body. I'm not a Platonist in the sense that the physics and chemistry of our universe are somehow bad and we should get away from them. No. God is going to have a physical manifestation, new heavens and a new earth, and I'm looking forward to that.
Well, along those lines, the one moment that really gave me pause in my worldview, that we've been exchanging ideas on this, you know, this idea, the simulation argument that no doubt you've read Nick Bostrom, you know, if we are a simulation, you know, if you can simulate consciousness in an artificial system, be it a computer or whatever other kind of device we construct, if it really can have inner sensations, inner worlds as we do, then there's some chance that we are in one of those right now. And this simulation was presumably created by some sentient being that built the computer and programmed it. And that is a notion.
Well, you're back to God again.
I'm back right down to God, except God is now some kid in a garage in some 26th century suburban home who had nothing better to do than create this simulation. It's not a very satisfying notion of God.
And it's not satisfying either, because we haven't a clue what consciousness is. And I find it more convincing when simulation is the name of the game. It's the imitation game still. We're nowhere near consciousness, or so the experts tell me.
And so do you think that consciousness of a sort that's familiar to us can be instantiated in a form that's
I doubt it. But that's another big question, because what you're then attributing consciousness to is a machine. And I think I find some of Roger Penrose's arguments that what we know of consciousness is probably not computable. And that has to do with Gödel's theorem and everything else, and you're probably well aware of this.
Sure.
I'm not convinced that that's going to be very good. I'm going to stick with the scenario that was started up 20 centuries ago, actually long before it, the tradition that goes back to Abraham. And that is what has given me real hope and enormous meaning in life. But it's been a sheer delight talking to you.
Yes, absolutely. I've enjoyed this very much. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure.